Hey everybody, Nick Espinoza, your chief security fanatic here. Don't forget to subscribe. And today we're going to do a deep dive on how technology helps deport people. Now, this basically requires discussion because no matter where you are in the world, what country, this obviously is a very serious issue. Every country has immigrations, customs, all this kind of stuff, and by virtue of that, also has deportations. And so let's talk about this. And before we dive in, I'm going to give you my political spiel, which simply is, especially if you're a longtime listener, you've heard this, cybersecurity is agnostic to politics, but we're not immune from it. Now, while this is a global issue, we're going to focus on the United States. And the reason why we're going to focus on the United States is that really immigration and deportation is incredibly prevalent in the news right now, given everything that's going on. And the Times basically had a good write-up on this by Paul Mosher, Adam Satariano, and Aaron Krolik. And I think that we should really talk about this. And so with that, we're going to be talking about the GEO Group. Now, they've essentially made an immigration app that tens of thousands of U.S. immigrants are essentially required to use. GEO Group, for the record, is also the largest private prison operator in the United States as well, so this kind of seems like they're dovetailing these two things together. But it goes beyond just this, because over the past decade, this company has also built a lucrative side business of digital tools. Not just the app or prisons, but ankle monitors, smartwatches, and then obviously the tracking apps to essentially surveil immigrants on behalf of the U.S. government. Now, these products are aiding President Trump's deportation efforts by providing the whereabouts of basically, you can call them illegal, unauthorized, undocumented, whatever you want to call them, unauthorized immigrants, etc., etc. So when I'm talking about immigrants, I'm going to be talking about the illegal, unauthorized, undocumented, again, whatever your term for those types of immigrants are, unless I'm specifying on legal immigrant. So essentially, this is aiding basically the Trump administration to understand the whereabouts of these types of immigrants to ICE, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Wing, and that's according to legal aid groups and immigration organizations. Now, no figures, for the record, have been released about the number of arrests made through this digital monitoring program, but legal aid programs estimate that it's at least in the hundreds since January 20th, when then President-elect became President Trump and his inauguration. Now, according to the Department of Homeland Security, more than 30,000 immigrants of all status types have been arrested basically by the Trump administration in the first 50 days of office. Now, the use of GEO Group's technology has made this company one of the Trump administration's biggest business partners and winners thus far. And even as essentially President Trump slashed costs across the federal government, his agencies have handed the GEO Group new federal contracts to essentially house those unauthorized immigrants. So they've got the app that tracks and surveils, and then they are the ones that have the private prisons and detention centers that these immigrants tend to end up in. So DHS, or the Department of Homeland Security, is also weighing the renewal of a longtime contract with GEO Group worth about $350 million just last year to track roughly 180,000 people now in the surveillance program. Republican lawmakers and administration advisors have also called for more surveillance of immigrants, including expanded location tracking and stricter enforcement of curfews. Again, that is not getting political. That is simply what has been happening essentially since the second Trump administration started. So with that, let's talk about the history of this app. Now, the tracking program that the GEO Group oversees is called Alternatives to Detention, and this was set up to keep tabs on unauthorized immigrants who face essentially potential deportation. Rather than being placed in detention centers or released into the country without supervision, these immigrants receive location tracking devices. They must quickly respond to alerts sent to these gadgets in order to confirm their whereabouts, or then risk potential punishment. In other words, if you are here as an unauthorized, illegal, undocumented, whatever immigrant, this essentially basically means you don't have to sit in a detention center or anything like that as you're here waiting for, let's say, your due process, your trial. You have this app, but you must adhere to these standards and practices lest you be put into a detention center. Now, the program highlights the technology's growing role in guarding borders, and this boom is now benefiting other companies on top of GEO Group, including Palantir and Jewel and Celebrite, all of which have won government contracts in this vein. Now, supporters obviously have praised the effectiveness and cost savings of these tools, and we will talk about those numbers, but critics have also warned that technology usage might lead to deeper surveillance of immigrant communities. In other words, not just those immigrants that are being forced to use this surveillance app or monitors or whatever it is, but also the community around them. Now, according to a senior lawyer with the ACLU, and I quote, "The government bills it as an alternative to detention, but we see it as an expansion to detention," end quote. At the time, Geo Group's products have essentially been glitchy. And that's one of the issues. They've also been expensive, and that's according to more than a dozen current and former employees and government officials, as well as a review of the company's federal contract and other records by the Times. Now, each time an immigrant sends a selfie to check in through the company's SmartLink app, which can basically happen millions of times a year, the federal government is paying roughly $1, according to portions of Geo Group's government contract obtained by the Times. The company charges $3 a day for any immigrant wearing its VeriWatch smartwatch, which, if lost, Geo Group then bills the federal government $380, which is basically more than the cost of an Apple Watch SE. So it's not an inexpensive program, but it is an effective program, at least according to the Trump administration. ICE, the Immigration Customs Enforcement, have also said in a statement that the monitoring program, quote, effectively increases court appearance rates and compliance with release conditions, end quote. The White House did not, for the record, respond to comments, and in a statement, Geo Group said that it had, quote, never advocated for or against, nor have we ever played a role in setting immigration enforcement policies, end quote. Now, that may be true, but if you're looking at it from that perspective, in my opinion, if you own the detention centers and you own their surveillance apps and tracking gadgets and all this kind of stuff, it absolutely is in your best interest to lobby for stricter immigration enforcement because you would make money. That just seems logical, and they're a for-profit business. So let's look at a bit of the history here, because obviously this did not start under the new Trump administration, and let's talk about this program. So in the early 2010s, in order to diversify, Geo Group started turning to digital surveillance. In 2011, they paid $415 million for behavioral interventions. This is a Colorado-based company that was founded in the 1970s to track cattle, which had been expanded into monitoring parolees. In other words, you're an American citizen, or possibly not, you're in the jail system or prison system here in the United States, you get out, now you're being tracked by behavioral interventions. And so they had an exclusive contract at that time with ICE to digitally monitor thousands of recently arrived immigrants. That's why Geo Group bought them. So the government plowed hundreds of millions of dollars into remote surveillance of immigrants over the next decade. That was especially ramped up during the Biden administration, obviously between the beginning of 2021 to the end of 2024. And the idea was that remote surveillance of immigrants facing removal proceedings would reduce the burdens on already packed detention centers and essentially relieve ICE officers of grunt work and obviously try and save money. So if you think about it this way, digitally monitoring an immigrant costs about $4.20 a day for the government versus about $150 a day in a detention center, according to ICE. You've got to feed them, basically give them shelter, and all those kinds of calculated costs that you would for any kind of prison or detention center that you would have. So by the end of 2022, there were more than 300,000 immigrants that were enrolled in this particular program. Geo Group's sales soared, but revenue did fall in 2023. And so the company then lobbied to expand surveillance. Kind of contradicts their official statement. Ahead of the 2024 election, a Geo Group subsidiary gave more than $2 million in campaign contributions to Republican candidates. If you remember the 2024 election, basically it was the Republican side of the House that was really talking about just we need to fix immigration, and on and on and on, way more so than the Democrats. Again, not getting political. That was simply the rhetoric at the time and still continues to this day. Now, the bulk going to groups supporting then candidate Trump and those running for Congress, essentially are running for Congress of those that supported then candidate Trump, and that's according to Federal Election Commission records. So it's not really in dispute where the Geo Group was spending their money. Wall Street analysts also included Geo Group, which has about 18,000 employees, in ideas for stocks that would perform well if then candidate Trump were elected, obviously defeating Kamala Harris. And we all know that we have a President Trump now, we don't have a President Harris. So with no real competition, some estimated that Geo Group's digital monitoring business could generate nearly $700 million of revenue cumulatively through the year 2026. Its biggest shareholders include BlackRock and Vanguard, so there is serious money behind them as well. And with that, let's discuss the experience with Geo Group's technology as it relates to these immigrants. In other words, if you're an immigrant, and you have to use Geo Group's technology, what does that really seem like? What does that look like? So for many of these immigrants who are not detained at the border, basically the journey through the United States ends inside the surveillance system that Geo Group has created. After turning themselves into immigration officers, they are then given an ankle bracelet or a smartwatch or a smartphone with the company's monitoring app installed. Rather than being overseen by ICE officers, they're then watched by case specialists at Geo Group itself. In other words, Geo Group employees. Under the program, immigrants live more freely in the United States during a legal process that can play out over years. In other words, they are given a court date. Everybody gets a court day, a day in court. Immigration, if you're an immigrant or whomever, that's basically constitutionally guaranteed. The trade-off that these immigrants have then is that they're being constantly monitored. Geo Group's app has permissions to continuously track a user's location, basically, and that's according to analysis of its code done by the Times. One Geo Group caseworker working out of the northeast of the United States, who declined to be identified out of fear of retaliation, described using a Google Maps-like software to essentially check immigrants' locations, as it's monitoring and tracking them pretty much at all times. If immigrants were not home or they lied about their whereabouts during a check-in, they receive a strike. Now, if an immigrant receives 3 strikes, a case specialist at Geo Group would then inform an ICE agent, who would then potentially increase monitoring or detain the person or expedite the person's deportation from the United States. Those under surveillance are limited in where they can travel, and that is one of those things. In other words, they are essentially geo-fenced to a specific location. And if an immigrant leaves that set area, that geo-fence, where they're supposed to be, the software then alerts a case officer. And because many check-ins must happen from home on a prescribed day. So like, for an example, let's say it's on a Friday, somewhere between 9 to 5 p.m., that oftentimes means they're stuck waiting at home, which could potentially affect their ability to work or perform certain day-to-day tasks. Former company employees also describe technical problems such as relying on outdated servers that frequently crashed, weak batteries in the company's smartwatches, meaning if it dies, then what, as you're wearing it, and also a bug in which the app occasionally failed to tell an immigrant to check in, which then resulted in a penalty that wasn't necessarily that immigrant's fault. On top of this, according to basically current and former ICE officials, Geo Group also basically stores data collected from the surveillance program on its private servers, which then makes it more cumbersome and difficult for the government to access and analyze. And so with that, let's talk about the backdrop of the new Trump administration here, because since Donald Trump took office, now President Trump, former candidate Trump, fewer immigrants have crossed the border as the president has signed legislation like the Laken-Riley Act, which mandates increasing detentions of immigrants with criminal histories in facilities like those owned by the Geo Group. Geo Group's technology has repeatedly helped ICE officers carry out deportations, according to multiple groups that are working with legal aid and all of that. Now, in January, ICE agents in Georgia, for example, tracked an immigrant to a job site and then detained him using, obviously, the Geo Group tracking app, while another one was detained outside of his church, according to groups. Another case in New Jersey, an immigrant in New Jersey, received a call from a Geo Group employee asking him to step outside his home because a tracker was not getting a signal. That was a ruse, and ICE agents were there to arrest him without a fuss. In other words, instead of trying to kick in the door if the guy would resist, he was outside of his home and much easier to capture. So think about it this way, because I think that reasonable people, and I don't care, again, what country you are, what your immigration standards are, wherever you're listening to this, I think reasonable people can agree that proper border security is needed to ensure both the safety and security of any country, Really doesn't matter where you are. I think it's important to have a framework of immigration and immigration laws that includes applications and paths to both living and working and eventually obtaining a citizenship. You can apply, you can go through approval process. In the United States here, you get a green card, which then allows you to work. You're here legally. You're doing everything by the book. I think reasonable people can also agree that in the long run, that people that are here illegally should face some kind of consequence for their action, which technically is a crime. It is. If you enter a country without going through the proper process, if I get off a plane in Canada and in some way am able to avoid Canadian customs, I technically would be breaking the law in Canada or the United States or anywhere else. And so I think the issue here that I have with this, though, is that the application of the law must be at all times applied with empathy and humanity. And that's one of my big issues here. Deporting a person back to their country of origin can be performed while humanely treating that person as an actual person. And in that vein, I think those that legitimately need asylum should be treated with dignity as well. There are a lot of people that come to the United States or other countries across the world as they are fearing and escaping violence, whether it's gang violence, government violence under authoritarianism. They're fearing for their lives and their family's life. Those people need to be understood. I hope nobody, absolutely nobody listening to this ever has to be a refugee from a country where you're fleeing violence and death. That's a horrific situation to put a human into. I mean, think about, especially if you're a parent, you want your kids in that situation as well. And I think that is what ultimately concerns me here. At the moment, we are going through a time where compassion for immigrants of any stripe seems to be an all-time low, at least here in the United States and some other countries as well. We have seen legal immigrants and even citizens being detained during blanket sweeps here, and I think that's cause for concern. We're not just talking about illegal immigrants or undocumented or whatever you want to call them. We're talking about legal immigrants that have played by the book. We're talking about citizens, whether you're born here or you've gone through the steps to naturalize yourself as a citizen. That's of concern. Look at the case of Kilmar Abrego Garcia. Right now, he is being held in the terrorism confinement center in the country of El Salvador, where he is originally from. He entered this country illegally in the United States. I'm sitting here in the United States, and he was granted legal protection by an actual judge from being deported in 2019. In other words, he started to rectify all of this. He even married an American citizen. They've got children here and all of this. He started doing everything by the book. He has no criminal record whatsoever outside the already adjudicated illegal entry into this country that was reconciled roughly 6 years ago. The Trump administration sent him to that prison in El Salvador and admitted that it was a mistake. The Supreme Court even ruled 9-0. All 9 justices of all political stripes ruled to bring him back. But here we are, right? And now, essentially, the administration has signaled that they're starting to look to do this to basically citizens as well. Homegrown, as they call it. Now, I'm bringing this up, and again, not for politics. This is not political. I'm bringing this up because when we add in the continuously improving sophistication in surveillance technology, it's a serious issue for everybody. If this basically does actually turn towards U.S. citizens, and for whatever reason, you're getting rounded up and deported somewhere that's not necessarily the country of your origin, as we found that many have been deported to these El Salvadorian prisons, and they're not from El Salvador. This is a huge issue because the Geo Group and their technology pales in comparison to the iPhones and the Androids that we're all walking around with every single day. There's really nothing stopping the federal government from going to the Facebooks of the world, and especially Facebook, who will give them gladly total access in exchange for things like having the anti-monopoly charges dropped. Right? They can go to Verizon or T-Mobile or a cellular carrier and get geolocation data on any of us at will. And if you're saying get a warrant, well, that would be rather easy in this situation as well. So, it really shouldn't matter what your political beliefs are here. I don't care if you're a Republican or Democrat or somewhere in between, like I am, just trying to call balls and strikes, going after citizens or legal immigrants with the aid of technology and without due process of the law that the U.S. Constitution actually gives us. It's enshrined that we get our day in court. This should be a concern to us all. And so I'll leave you with those thoughts. It's very concerning for me to see what's happening. I understand the difference between illegal, undocumented, unauthorized, whatever you want to call that type of immigration. But I also know that no matter who we are, the Constitution, as the founders framed it, is set up for the world. In other words, if you're here, you have these universal rights. And if we start abandoning those universal rights, it's only a matter of time that it comes for everybody. And I think that is of deep concern. And I'm not saying the Trump administration is going to go that far. I'm not part of their administration. I don't know what their day-to-day or end-to-end motives are. But the point is that when you see these things, you really should talk about them. And again, I'm not blaming necessarily anybody here either, only in the sense that, we have an evolving situation and we have to see how this is going to play out. But it's of deep concern. And that's all I'm going to say. So, I don't care if you absolutely love or absolutely hate the current administration or anything else. What we should all agree on, no matter what political stripe that we're in, is that at the end of the day, the law of the land is the Constitution. And the Constitution says we have rights. And I think that applies to everybody. And please like, share, follow me here on Facebook and Twitter at NickAESP. And please feel free to subscribe to me at YouTube as well. And as always, stay safe, stay online, and please attempt to stay private, secure, and informed. Take care.